confused and convoluted and leading to conflict, which soon appeared on Earth. And one of the events that took place, relatively too many years after the establishment of that great pattern of landing pattern in Jerusalem and the Space Force, etc., and the 2 artificial mountains in Egypt, was that wars broke out. And the first war that I named in my book, The Wars of Gods and Men, the Pyramid Wars, because there was a series of them, had to do with these facilities, because in the Great Pyramid, one of the two especially, which is the only one that has an ascending passage and chambers, all the others have just a descending passage, they were a prize that one side tried to deprive from the other, and the first series of pyramid wars took place there. In that particular war, the two main protagonists were the main son of Enlil, called Ninurta, and the main son of Enki, called Marduk. And in that war, it was Ninurta who was the victor, and his victory was commemorated in some cylinder seals and other depictions. This was his symbol, the eagle, and this was his victory's depiction, how he won the war over the two pyramids, and another depiction where you see actually all three pyramids. And this, by the way, is another of the proofs, of which I have many, and I deal with it extensively, of who built the pyramids and when they were built, and that you see that already in Sumerian times, which preceded the pharaonic times by thousands of years, the existence of the pyramids was already known. Around 2900 BC, a Sumerian king called Gilgamesh went in search of immortality. Now, the whole business of immortality doesn't really exist, because all the tales tell us that these so-called gods, the Anunnaki, were both born and died. And there are tales about both birth and death. But it is all relative. That's why the Greeks called the gods, they borrowed the Sumerian pantheon, they called them the immortals. But it was only a difference in what a year is. If the Anunnaki come from a planet whose orbit is about 3,600 of our years, to them it is 1 year. If you would ask an Anunnaki, how old are you? He'll say, whatever, I'm 20 years old, which means my planet, Nibiru, made 20 rounds around the sun. If you ask somebody here, so we won't ask people for their ages, of course, but you ask, how old are you? And he'll answer, it means my planet, where I grew up, to which I genetically belong, made X number of orbits around the sun. That's a year. So, but anyway, Gilgamesh was the son of a goddess. And he came to his mother, and it actually was not only a demigod, but he was 2/3 divine, because his mother, not his father, his mother was a god, a goddess. And he said, if I'm 2/3 divine, 2/3 Anunnaki genetically, why should I die like a mortal? And she said to him, you're right, but in order to attain our longevity, you have to go and be on our planet. So he went in search of immortality, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is a well-known literary work from antiquity, translated in antiquity already in many of those ancient languages. Now, where did Gilgamesh go in search of immortality? He had to go to places from which he would be taken aloft to the planet of the gods. So if you remember this design, this is what I showed you. And this is Jerusalem, which is only mission control center. He had, and this one, where is it? This one was destroyed in the pyramid wars. So he had two places to go. One was the great platform in the mountains here, and one was the spaceport itself. And so around 2900 BC, almost 5,000 years ago, he went in search of a place to be taken aloft and join the gods on their planet. Now the first one that I showed you, this one, is in the mountains of Lebanon. The great cedar forest there is depicted and described in detail in the epic tale of Gilgamesh. And the text says that he witnessed on the night before he entered or tried to enter the place, he saw a rocket launched. And lo and behold, archaeologists have discovered a Phoenician coin from a place not far from there that shows the great platform and a rocket ship on a podium. So it did exist. Now that place still exists and can be visited. I went there at some risk. I would not advise you to go at this time because it's the headquarters of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. But the place is called Baalbek, and there is there a vast stone platform of about 500,000 square feet. And here at this northwestern corner, there are ruins of temples built over temples. The latest one are Muslim and Byzantine and Roman, but they are built on or over a platform that pre-existed. And these are some of the most ancient ruins that you see there, of levels that keep rising from down there, rising and rising and rising and rising and rising. And these stone blocks weigh between 600 to 900 tons each. And the immensity of the place is mind-boggling. Even more mind-boggling is one of the courses in the western wall of that enclave, on the western wall, on top of these huge boulders. And the three of them, 1, 2, and the third one, known as the Trilithon. This is the drawing, the image. This is a line drawing of a person, so you can see the scale. So there are three of these huge stone blocks lying in one of the courses, one of the levels, next to each other. And they weigh 1,100 tons each. Now, there is no piece of equipment, even today, that can lift 1,100 tons, or even 1,000 tons, or even 600 tons. There's no such piece of equipment. Yet, and this is a photograph, by the way, I think. Can you see that little ant there? That's me. I'm standing there. And this is one, the first trilithon, and then there are two more. Now we know where they came from, because about 1.5 miles away, there is the quarry from which those stone blocks were cut and lifted and brought. And one of them is unfinished. So right here it's still part of the native rock, and this part has been already cut. And again, this is me there. So you can see the size. So somebody in antiquity, and according to all the evidence before the flood, cut those stones and lifted them over 1.5 miles and put them there, not drop them on the ground, but put them exactly where they should be, where they belong. And the question is, what was the purpose of this whole thing? As I said, Gilgamesh reported that he saw a rocket ship launch there, and the Phoenician coin also depicted. And it was only after I saw photographs of about a year ago, I think, of the Chinese launching their spacecraft for the first time. Now, we are used to launch towers made of metal and so on, but this is also built out of some kind of stone. So I have no doubt that what we see there now, where is the one? Right, because this is exactly the same thing as the Chinese have built, because this starts somewhere there and goes down and down and down and down to well below ground. So this was a launch site to which Gilgamesh went around 5,000 years ago in order to be lofted to the planet of the gods, Nibiru. But he failed. There's a whole tale that he had a companion, and they killed the sacred bull, the bull of heaven, and had to escape for their life. So it didn't work. So he didn't give up. He went to the other destination, which, if you recall a previous slide, was the spaceport in the Sinai Peninsula. And what was there we also know, because the Egyptian has depicted it, and this is a depiction found in the tomb of an Egyptian called Hui, who was the governor in ancient times of the Sinai Peninsula. And in his tomb, the burial chamber is surrounded on the walls with depictions of scenes from the lands where he was an official. And this is from the Sinai, and I think you can see that this is an underground silo, because you see the ground level with trees and giraffes, etc., and you see it multi-stage rocket ship and the command module sticking out from above ground. So this is what existed in the Sinai Peninsula. Oops, we go forward. Right. And again, like in the Sumerian tales, there are Egyptian texts. The collection is called the Book of the Dead, because the Egyptian pharaohs claimed that they have, by being a pharaoh, they were divine, semi-divine, demigods, and had the right after they died, in an afterlife, to join the gods in an afterlife. So after they died, according to the Book of the Dead, they went on a simulated journey to the spaceport, to where the spacecraft or rocket ships are, and then to be taken aloft and the Book of the Dead has many illustrations. This is just one of them that shows the 4 pilots that welcomed him aboard the spacecraft, one of the pharaohs. So there's no doubt that there too the facility for being taken aloft did exist. However, it does not exist anymore. Baalbek still exists in ruins, but the spaceport in the Sinai does not exist because in one of the next wars between the various clans of the Anunnaki, the Enlilites, the Enkiites, Ninurta, Marduk, etc., they resorted to the use of nuclear weapons. And the spaceport in the Sinai was a target. And you can see to this day 2 things. One is you can see the immense cavity to this day from space. This is a NASA photograph, and the crack in the peninsula is the result. And if you go there, which I did by myself and with a group, if you go there, you find in that particular spot, you find in the middle of pure white limestone mountains. Everything is pure white. You see a huge field with broken, burnt, and totally blackened rocks. And one of the visits, I took samples. They were tested. There's possibly some radioactivity, but it's inconclusive. But in 2024, almost 4,000 years ago, the Anunnaki resorted to the use of nuclear weapons. There is a long text called the Era Epic, E-R-R-A, Epic, that describes the reasons, who did it, how they did it, what the number of nuclear weapons that were used in 2024. The unintended consequence of that was that a wind blowing from the Mediterranean brought what they called in those texts, they're called lamentation texts, they called the evil wind that brought death to everything alive in Sumer. As the nuclear wind passed, reaching from the Sinai to Sumer, it did not destroy anything. The lamentation text lament that the stalls stand, but the animals that were there are all dead. The houses stand, but everybody who lived in the houses lies dead in the streets, on the roofs, etc. And that was the end of the great Sumerian civilization about 2024 BC. And in that one, unlike in the previous wars, where Ninurta, the son of Enlil, was the victor, Marduk, the son of Enki, was the victor, and that was the beginning of the rise of Babylon. Instead of Sumer and Enlil and all the others, it was now the era and the time of Marduk and the Babylonians. Now we are starting to leave ancient history, and we are starting, or I'm starting, to take you by the hand and lead you not only to the present but also to the future. And to understand where history is taking us, this map is the key to it, and please try to remember it. If you recall the layout of the landing corridor from Mount Ararat this way, and Jerusalem as Mission Control Center, and the spaceport, the Giza Pyramids, and the place in Lebanon called Baalbek today. These are the 4 space-related sites that if you keep them in mind, you understand what happened afterwards, what happened in recent times, and what the present conflict is all about. When the dust, let's use that expression, the dust of the nuclear explosion and the demise of Sumer settled, several hundred years later, when perhaps passage was possible again after the use of nuclear weapons here, a major event took place. It is called the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. And the Bible says that after about 400 years, God remembered. He said, oh, by the way, I forgot all about those people. There was this guy Abraham, and I promised him a certain land, the promised land. I made a covenant with him. And then I forgot all about it. But now it's time to fulfill my promises. And the Israelites left Egypt, and I didn't write it yet in any of my books, but I can tell you now that if I ever do, I will tell you that the starting point of the Exodus was the Sphinx, because the Sphinx gazes precisely along the 30th parallel towards the spaceport. There was, of course, no more spaceport there, but the mountains remained, and the mountain which held the various facilities was there, and the Bible calls it Mount Sinai, the mount in the Sinai Peninsula, Har Elohim, the mountain of the gods, of the Anunnaki. So they were sent here on this Exodus to resume the relationship, the commandments, etc., which required for them to proceed to accept all the moral teachings of the Sumerians. I think in my very first book, The 12th Planet, when I talk about the Sumerian law codes, I say everybody, most people know about all the ancient law codes. Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, his law code, which is on a stone block in the Louvre in Paris, is a code of crime and punishment. It says, if you did this, that's your punishment. The Sumerian law codes, and there's one, for example, by a king 1,000 years before Hammurabi, 1,400 years before Hammurabi, that was a law code of justice that said you shall not take away the donkey of a widow. You shall not delay the wages of a day laborer. Those were the Sumerian law codes. So these were the Sumerian commandments, the Sumerian moral laws that had to be reaccepted, renegotiated at Mount Sinai. And once they were, they had to continue. There was difficulty in going straight. They went around, but anyway, finally they got to Jerusalem. And what did they do once they got to Jerusalem? They built the temple to Yahweh on a platform that existed there. And if you have not done it yet, I urge you to go to Jerusalem, because along the Western Wall, this of course doesn't exist anymore. This is now replaced by a Muslim structure. Along this Western Wall, just as along the Western Wall in Baalbek, in the landing place of Gilgamesh, and this is an aerial photograph. This is the area that's called the Temple Mountain. And this is where the temple stood, and the Holy of Holies, and the Ark of the Covenant. Interestingly enough, that I noticed when I was there and when looking at there are trees everywhere, but not here. Nothing grows here. So this is the western wall, and an opening was made along the western wall after being blocked for thousands of years. And what was discovered there is mind-boggling, because in the same place, the western wall, as in the landing place where Gilgamesh went, there is a trilithon, not of 1,100,000 tons, but only 600 or 700 tons, 3 immense stone blocks lying one next to the other, just as there. And somewhere there, there is a sign that says that this is exactly where a tunnel leads to the Holy of Holies above the platform. This is another shot of the trilithon in Jerusalem. Now, when Yahweh, the God of the Bible, commanded David and then Solomon to build a temple exactly on a pre-existing platform, this is what he said. These are exact words in translation. And if you, I cannot read from this angle. Will anybody read out loud, please?
Thus has said the Lord Yahweh, this is Jerusalem. In the midst of the nations I placed her, and all the lands are in a circle round about her.
Well, in the midst of the nations, in the center of the circles. Well, that could not be more explicit that this is the layout of the Mission Control Center. Now, at about the time that the Hebrews, the Israelites, were restoring the platform in Jerusalem, other things were happening in the adjoining countries, especially those countries that followed Marduk, the Babylonian one. In Babylonia, on cylinder seals, the sign of the cross began to appear. In Assyria, the kings began to wear the sign of the cross on their chest. The same happened in Egypt. Now, these are all from around 1000 BC, 900 BC, 800 BC, 700 BC. Now, what does it mean? What does it signify? Well, the sign of the cross, it may come as a surprise to my Christian friends. The sign of the cross is not a new sign, and not a sign developed or invented at the time of Jesus. This is a very ancient Sumerian sign, and each time that the planet Nibiru, that usually was depicted as a winged disk, was on its way back to our vicinity, each time that the reappearance of Nibiru was expected, the depiction, the symbolism for Nibiru, for the planet, changed from the winged disk to the cross. So this one, for example, this is one of the most ancient ones. This is another one. This is when agriculture was granted to mankind, and so on. And if you look at the orbit of Nibiru, roughly 3,600 years. In my book, The End of Days, I explain why the orbit might have become a little shorter, only 3,450 years. But anyway, we can work with this 3,600, which is a good round number and part of the sexagesimal system. 6, 10, 60, 360, 3,600. So from the time that Nibiru was in our vicinity, making the great round around the sun, which is called the perigee, the point closest to the sun. He goes out, slows down, reaches this point, the apogee, and then starts on its way back. So at some point, the planet is here, or here, or here, or here, or here, or here, and at some point, the anticipation of its return begins. And that, I suggest, is when the sign of the cross began to reappear. In one of my books, The Wars of Gods and Men, I deal with all the various wars that took place, not only the very early ones, but in particular the ones that started to become more frequent and more ferocious as the return of Nibiru became closer and closer. It seems as if it became much more important who would be in control, who would welcome them, whose particular aspect of religion would be more predominant, etc. And it was at that time, precisely around 750 BC, that the biblical prophecies also started. They started with the prophet Amos around 750 BC. Now, in general, no distinction is made by people writing on the subject, and most of whom really don't know Hebrew, so they rely on translations. The whole thing, biblical prophecy, is taken as as one lump subject. But if you know Hebrew, and if you study the various prophecies in great detail and know the precision of the Hebrew language, you begin to see that the prophets were really talking about two different things. One was called the Day of the Lord, and Amos spoke about it. Another, I think, I quote Habakkuk. I can't see from this angle. Anyway, they started to talk about the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is coming. The day of the Lord is near. And it was described as a time of celestial phenomena. There would be darkness at noon. You will not be able to see the stars at night. The moon will not shine its light, etc. and so on and so forth. I don't know if it's easy for you. I had about 30 slides with all these biblical quotations, but I realized that it would be very difficult even for the audience to read them. So at the same time, similar prophecies known as Akkadian prophecies, Assyrian prophecies, Babylonian prophecies began to also talk about the return, the celestial Lord would come from the south, would be first seen in this constellation and so on. And I drew some of these charts to show you and show how you can relate some of the text to the progress of Nibiru coming back to Earth's vicinity. This is another sketch that really renders as a sketch literal wording, saying you first can see it from there, then you can see it here, and so on and so forth, as the planet returns. There were even discoveries of astronomical records. These are called astrolabes because they depict the circular heavens around Earth on plain paper with all the stars being named, where the progression of Nibiru from being seen in this part of the heavens to being seen in this part of the heavens at its apogee, its perigee, is actually recorded as having been witnessed and seen by Assyrian and Babylonian astronomers. Well, this is one of the texts accompanying one of the astrolabes. And as becomes obvious as you study all these texts, that the main feature they are talking about is a day of darkness, darkness at noon, the sun will not be seen, etc., which we can say they are really talking about the solar eclipse. And the Assyrian records, I think that's what I showed in the previous slide, talk about a darkness at noon and an eclipse at an unexpected time, because all these eclipses could be predicted. They had enough knowledge to predict solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, etc. So in exactly 556 BC, and this is a sketch, a sky map prepared by NASA, not by me. In 556, an unusual and unexpected eclipse, darkness at noon, took place. And it is my conclusion in the book, The End of Days, that is exactly when Nibiru last was near Earth and created that eclipse. So if you go back to the problem posed by 2012, and you say, well, 2012 is when Nibiru is expected to return and do this or do that, be a good omen or bring harmful things, will be the apocalypse, the end. It does not work, because the last time that Nibiru was near Earth was 556 BC, and if it has an orbit of about 3,600, 3,400, 3,500 years, and if it has an orbit of about 3,600, 3,400, 3,500 years, it ain't coming back in 2012. So what might happen, if not in 2012, in some other time, in our lifetimes perhaps? And this takes me to the other part of the biblical prophecies, where I told you that there were really two things that were discussed and prophesied. From about 750 BC to about 550 BC, the time of Ezekiel, they spoke about the day of the Lord, the celestial Lord. It's coming, it's nearing, it's coming from the south, it will darken the skies, etc., etc. But then the other part, they switched to a term called Acharita Yamim, the end of days, which some translate end time or any other way people want to translate. But the time, the question is, what do we mean by time? But whatever we call time will come to an end. And we have to remember, and this is the purpose of this slide, to show you that the Anunnaki were coming and going between their planet and the Earth, not necessarily when Nibiru was closest to Earth. As a matter of fact, they could not do that, because it is at this point that the planet, their planet, that slows down here, gains speed, and moves fastest around the sun. So the only way they could come here was if they left their planet ahead of time and speeded ahead of the planet and were here and then rejoined the planet, or when the planet was starting on the way back to slow down, then they would, as if literally, fall back towards the sun and come to our vicinity. So there were all kinds of ways, and there are tales. There are tales about this god, this goddess. There is a tale about a king called the Tana who was taken to heaven. He was afraid to continue the trip when he started to see the earth become smaller and smaller. There was one of the sons of Enki by an earthling woman called Adapa, who was taken for a visit with Anu in heaven, taken and brought back. So he did not stay 3,600 years on Nibiru. So comings and goings are possible even when Nibiru is not precisely at its closest to us. And what did happen in 556 BC, when so many of the other nations expected the Anunnaki to show up again, is that instead of showing up, they left. I don't have the slides here, and I'm not intending to spend more time because I'm way beyond my time already. But in the book, I suggest that the point of departure was the famous Nazca lines in South America. But what is without doubt known, and this is perhaps part of the Mayan prophecies, is that the chief deity of Mesoamerica, whom the Aztecs called Quetzalcoatl, the Mayan called Kukulkan, which all meant the plumed or the winged serpent. Before he left, he said, this is written down, he said, I will return, I promise to return. And he promised to return at a certain point, which is related to the Mesoamerican calendars. Now, the so-called Mayan calendar, where the whole business of 2012 appears, is really a calendar called the Long Count, which was started not by the Mayas, was started by the Olmecs, people from Africa who were brought over by Quetzalcoatl, that I identified as the Egyptian god Thoth, were brought over in 3113 BC. And this is the calendar that the Mayas used. The whole business of 2012 is based because the calendar, its various symbols depict 1 day or 20 days or 360 days, etc. And this is called this one is called the Baktun, and 13 Baktuns will culminate in, by some calculation, 2012. Now, it depends how one calculates, because it depends if you divide the days by 365 or by 360. One way that has been suggested only a century ago really arrives at 2087 as the Mayan 13th Baktun. But in general, my feeling is that it is not applicable at all, because if you follow the biblical prophecies, they are dealing with a cyclical timetable. This so-called Mayan calendar is a linear one, like day 1, day 2, day 3, etc. The same as the AD calendar. 2000, 2001. Why nothing happened 2000? Because after 2000 came 2001. Like I showed you at the beginning, that some said 2000, then said 2003, 2000. All the predictions in the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, speak of a cycle. The beginning will be the ending. The ending is the beginning. The past is the future. And this can take place only in a cyclical thing. And what was is more quotes of the same subject about the end of days and what will happen there. Now, the best clues in the Old Testament about this whole business of the end of days, when will it be, not only what will happen, but when will it be, is in the book of Daniel. I just almost skipped fast because it takes too long to start reading all that. But one of those that really devoted the better part of his life to studying the meaning of the prophecies and the timetable given in the book of Daniel. And there's some number of years, but the best clue is where the angels tell Daniel the end of days will come after half time, time, and 2 times. And Daniel, like we say, what do you mean by that? What half time are you talking about? I'm not talking about football, right? And he was left with no answer. So Sir Isaac Newton, who is known more about celestial orbits and such other things, spent most of his time delving into those prophecies and trying to calculate them. And a handwritten document by him came to light relatively recently, 2-3 years ago. And when it came to light, the news headlines were that Sir Isaac Newton calculated the end of days at 2100 AD, 2160 AD. I was fortunate to be able to obtain a photocopy of that handwritten page, which is written front and back. In the book, The End of Days, I give what it says. I quote what it says. I do not show the photographs because I have no permission to do that. So you are now seeing, you are the first ones to see the photograph of the handwritten document by Sir Isaac Newton. And he calculated also in 3 ways. And the number 2160 does indeed feature heavily in his calculations. But when I looked at his calculations on the back of the page, I said, oh my God, he is talking about zodiacal times. Because one of the things, again, a so-called Sumerian first, was the devising of the zodiac, of calculating how the earth on the first day of spring here, after a full year, does not precisely return to where it was, but is slightly retarded. The retardation amounts to 1 degree of 360 in 72 years, and a 30-degree zodiacal house, therefore 30 times 72 is 2160. So the mathematical zodiacal time is 2160 160 years. And there's no doubt, though, the beginning of the zodiac is attributed to the Greeks, that the Sumerians knew it. They named all the 12 zodiacal constellations in the correct order. This is all Sumerian names. They depicted them the way we still use to this day. So there's no doubt that they knew the zodiacal times. But again, as with other things, how could they? How could any immortal Sumerian not only measure the delay of 1 degree in 72 years, but of 30 degrees of the shift from one zodiacal house to another in 2,160 years? And the answer is that, again, this was a Anunnaki device and not a Sumerian device. And what is important to keep in mind is that the time scale, so that's perhaps when the ancients told Daniel time, half time, 2 times, that they were talking about divine time, the Anunnaki time, is because I ask myself, and I give that answer also in the book, The End of Days, is what prompted, what caused the Anunnaki in 2024 BC to resort to the use of nuclear weapons? What was the problem? And the problem was that Marduk said that the age of the bull, the age of Taurus, which was the age of Enlil, is ending, he said, and my age, the age of the ram, the age of Aries, is beginning. He claimed that this is the correct zodiacal scale. So he said around 2200 BC, the age of Enlil, the age of Taurus, has ended, and my age, the age of Aries, has begun. The others, and this is all in those texts, by the way, the others said to him, no, you are wrong, because don't go by some chart. Look at the heavens. In the heavens, on the first day of spring, we are still in the age of the bull. We are still in the age of Taurus. Why? Because the three zodiacal constellations of the bull, of the ram, and of Pisces are not the same size. So, though Marduk claimed that his age has already begun, it was still observationally, really in the heavens, the age of Enlil, of his rivals, Ninurta, and so on. So this was such a bitter fight that they resorted to nuclear weapons to deprive each other of the spaceport. Now, there is another cylinder seal. It is at the Hermitage Museum in Russia. There's no doubt about its date. It's 2500 BC. And it shows, in my opinion, without doubt, an astronaut on the 6th planet, which is Mars, greeting an astronaut on the 7th planet, which is Earth. You remember, I asked you to keep it in mind, Earth and its moon. And between them, there is a spacecraft. So, a return of the Anunnaki with a stopover on Mars, one greeting the other, has occurred. And there is a date. There is a date on this cylinder seal. Do you see the date? Pisces. The age of Pisces. The age of Pisces. So does this mean that the return of the Anunnaki and the end of days, with its 2,160-year calculation, will still come about this century? Maybe. Because there is a because, ladies and gentlemen. Because just at the place that, according to the New Testament, is called Armageddon, where the final war will take place, a mosaic floor in the first church ever built in the Holy Land, since the time of Jesus, has on its floor the sign of Pisces. This was discovered 2 or 3 years ago at Armageddon, which really means in Hebrew Har Megiddo, the Mount of Megiddo, which is in Israel. Now, are all these omens, or is it just a tale to tell you at ARE? I don't know. I believe that these are omens.